Okay, let's talk about the tools of the Federal Reserve. The stated goal of the Federal Reserve, and the reason we have a central bank, is to maintain full. Speaking particularly there of this concept of recessions and depressions. Again, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Prior to the central bank, there were many state banks. Most of these state banks were created by the states, not by the federal government. And those banks dealt with gold and silver coins. And they would take gold and silver coins in deposit, and they would put some in reserve to make loans. And when those banks would create a lot of low-powered money in particular areas, if they loaned out the maximum they could radically expand the money supply in these rural areas, as we saw in our illustration with the First Bank of Dodge City. And those rural areas would boom with economic activity. And there was this idea of exuberance, and people could see this trend of how things were going up, and everything was expanding, and they got these visions of grandeur, and they began to borrow more and more because everything was going up and business was expanding and expanding, not realizing that all of this demand for all this activity was really coming from an increase in the money supply rather than an increase in productivity or an increase in the demand for their goods. And so eventually that crescendo of economic activity would kind of peak out, and all of a sudden it started to go down. And once it started to go down, all the enthusiasm was lost, and what turned into a boom rapidly turned into a bust as all these loans went bad and the economy collapsed and the money supply collapsed, and it was collapsing all the way back down to the amount of original high-powered money that there was. And when that happened in all these rural areas, they were called wildcat banks because they were kind of wild. And they called those instances panics. They were called bank panics. Now again, we have boom-bust cycles, what we call panics, long before we had fiat money. We had real commodity money, gold and silver coins, but we still had bank panics, which were tied to the fractional reserve banking system and expanding of the money supply, or at least the perceived money supply. And these bank panics caused a lot of discomfort, to say the least. A lot of people, after the panic, realized, oops, the bank went belly up, my money is gone. I used to have money in the bank, but now the bank's not there. The bank's closed down. When people start coming in the front door for the bank to get their money out, the president of the bank told the head cashier, you got enough money to go for another 2 hours. I'm going to go to the saloon here, and I'm going to get a few drinks. And he was out of the state in a matter of hours. He was long gone. When the cashiers ran out of money, they just said, hey, we're out of money. Bank's busted. It's broke. We are bankrupt. And everybody else in the line gets nothing. First people in line got their stuff. The majority of people in line got nothing. They were called bank panics. They were called runs on the banks. And they were very destructive. The boom was fun, but the bust was agonizing. So one of the reasons for having a bank of last resort, like a central bank, is to have us on a fiat monetary system in which the money would not be gold and silver, but the money would really be based upon the credit and the high-powered money-creating power of the central bank. So if any particular bank had a run, it doesn't wind up into a panic and a bust because the bank can always borrow money from the central bank to stop the run. And once you break the consumer psychology of they're no longer afraid and they have faith in the bank again, well, then everything's good. We don't have to have bank panics. So we can end panics if we get a central bank. And that was one of the stated purposes of the central bank, to be a banker's bank or a bank of last resort. Not just a bank of last resort for commercial banks, but a bank of last resort for the government when nobody's going to loan the government any money. Well, they can always go to the Fed because the Fed's never going to run out of Fed credit. So, the duties of the Fed, stated in most textbooks, and I'll just go through these briefly because they're in the textbook, is to conduct monetary policy. Monetary policy, we had it up here. We want to control the economy by controlling the money supply, and that means we want to get full employment without inflation. That's what we mean by controlling the economy. We want to get everybody employed, but we don't want to overheat the economy because we don't want to have inflation. And we also need an organization like the Fed to supervise all these commercial banks out there so they don't get out of hand and they don't take their reserves down too low and they don't do risky stuff that could cause a run on the bank, which could, the psychology could spread to other banks and we get a run on the whole system. So we need them to supervise these financial institutions. When we talk about supervising financial institutions, don't think just banks. Think pawn shops. Financial institution. They're making loans, right? You bring it in, you pawn it, and they give you money. It's kind of like, that's a financial institution. Or racing, horse racing. There's a lot of cash, a lot of stuff going on there. So any financial institution that deals with money can be regulated by the Fed. Again, it provides banking service to the federal government as the lender of last resort, and all the texts, watch this wording, the Fed issues coin and currency. Now, the wording is technically correct, but the inference there, you got to watch the inference. The Fed issues physical coins and physical paper dollars. But the Fed doesn't mint the coins. That's done by the United States Mint. And the Fed does not print the money. That's done by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So there is a government mint that its job is to mint nickels and dimes and quarters. And then there is a Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the BEEP, and it prints $1, $5, $10, $50, $100 bills. And what those government agencies do is that they make this product and they have one customer. That one customer is the central bank. That's the only person that they will sell these dollars to and these coins to. And they sell this $1 at basically the cost to print that dollar. I don't know, 5 cents maybe, for all the little security threads and all that sort of stuff. And so the Fed can buy a dollar bill for 5 cents. It can buy a $100 bill for 5 cents because that's what it costs to print it. Now, for a long time, that sort of thing, that's not really a whole lot of money because there's not that much currency out there. But that's called seigniorage. If the government wants to make a 1 ounce silver dollar and it puts $20 worth of silver, no, it puts 20 cents worth of silver into that silver dollar. Okay, it costs 20 cents, maybe 5 cents a minute. That means the government, once they're done, that coin has a purchasing power of $1 that only costs them 25 cents to make that silver dollar. So the difference is called seigniorage, Seinnorige. It's a French term. I think that's right. Google it. Seigniorage. And governments have been making profits off of seigniorage for a long time. Unfortunately, what happened in this country once we had a Federal Reserve in 1913, the money supply doubled from 1913 up to 1929. We had a boom period because the government expanded the money supply the Federal Reserve increased the money supply over 2.5 times. Well, if we're going to increase the money supply, we just don't have a boom in a local area. Now we got a boom for the entire economy. And of course, that boom turned into a bust in 1929 when everything began to go back south again. But we're talking about seigniorage. And the Fed issues that. So these two institutions, the Mint and the BEP, Bureau of Engraving and Printing, print this, and then it gets shipped to the Fed, and then the Fed takes it and ships it to the banking system. So does the Fed issue coin currency? Yes. Does the Fed mint coins? No. Does the Fed mint paper dollars? No. I know we're trying to be academically precise. So if you said, well, the Fed creates as much money as it wants. Well, that's technically true. The Fed creates as many paper dollars as it wants. Well, in effect, that's true, but you need to know that as a practical matter, only the physical government, only the national federal government actually prints the fiat money, but it goes to the Fed and it gets issued from the Fed. So when we read in our text that the Fed issues coin and currency, notice that that's exactly what they do. They issue it. They do not create it. And the Fed also acts as a check clearing service. That used to be a big deal in the past. The Fed was so poor at doing that on an efficient basis that the major banks just quietly took it back over because they had to get their checks cleared on a more efficient basis than the Fed was doing it. So although that used to be mentioned as a function of the Fed, as a very important duty as the Fed, the major banks just got together and said, this is taking too long. It's just cutting into our profits. It's inefficient. And so, yeah, we'll let them to go ahead and clear some stuff, but we're going to take over the bulk of the clearing operations ourselves. And they did, and they are. Now, that takes us to what we want to talk about in this section of the three tools of the Fed. How does the Fed conduct monetary policy? What are the three major tools of the Fed? The first major tool of the Fed is something you're familiar with. We said that commercial banks take deposits, they keep required reserves, and then they issue loans out of the excess reserves. Well, this required reserves here, do they get to set any required reserves they want? Some might want to keep 80% reserve, 50% reserve, 20%. How about we keep a dime? 10% reserve. How about 1% reserve? How about 1/100th of a cent reserve? In terms of the central bank of Britain, they don't have any reserves. The commercial banks don't have any reserves at all. But the Fed controls this reserve rate. The Fed can dictate to the commercial banks how much money they have to keep in reserves. Now, the more money that they tell the bank have to keep in reserve, the less the multiplier and the less amount of low-powered money that the commercial banks can create. If the Fed lowers the required reserve rate, then the commercial banks can create a whole lot more low-powered money. So the first tool that the Fed has for controlling the money supply is either increasing or decreasing the required reserves of the commercial banks. Now that's the first tool of the Fed, but realize the Fed rarely does that. It really messes up the bank system because the banks got a whole organization here. They've got a plan. They know what the rules and regulations are. And then they just, if you start messing with that, then you're throwing these banks into a big tizzy here. And it really, really inconveniences the banks. And so the Fed hardly ever does that. It just creates a hardship on the banking system. So yes, it's a tool. Do they use it? Very rarely. Very rarely. Now, for the second two or maybe three tools of the Fed, we're going to go into our next session when we talk about the remaining tools of the Fed to control the money supply in order to control the economy.